Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about 1 rep max lifts. Now, there are going to be times with this where people go, Jason, you sound like a broken record with this, and it's like because I need to. Because if I don't, then people don't seem to get it. And this is not just me who's noticed this. Again, this is hundreds and hundreds of lifters and coaches have noticed this over the years. It's well known, it's understood. And again, I have plenty of friends, other coaches I know, people who do the same stuff, and all of their lifters, and themselves included, they don't have problems. And that is this idea that when practicing 1 rep maxes, the actual lift itself is less important for carryover than actually just hitting a max. In other words, what you guys see me doing here, everything here is a non-classic lift, right? Everything I'm doing is not exactly a classic lift. Like you see that there, it's what? Half board, or it might have been a 1 board with chains, okay? Same thing here, 2-inch deficit deadlift. All right, these are all movements where I've changed the range of motion, changed the strength curve. And people will look at that and they'll go, well, you know, that doesn't count. It's not going to carry over. Well, why wouldn't it carry over? Okay, why wouldn't it carry over? Is it not a similar movement pattern? Is it not a similar movement pattern? Of course it's going to carry over. Did you build the muscle and strength and power to do the classic lift? If you've built the muscle and strength and power to do the classic lift, you have the physical attributes required to do it. Hitting different maxes like this, we could argue about a lot of the psychological benefits. I think they're pretty good. But when push comes to shove, maxing itself is a skill. And again, people have this idea in their head that the max only counts when it's with the lift, like the skill doesn't carry over to other stuff. And again, this is this whole concept of high specificity of training. Well, the problem is that if that was true, there wouldn't be guys who do it this other way and still hit just as big a lifts in various competition. Okay, and that's kind of your take-home message. That is the counter argument for the guys who push the high specificity training. That, oh, it's got to be with the exact competition lift or it doesn't carry over. Yet there are just as many world champions who don't do it that way, who just hit other lifts, again, using conjugate type training, and there have been for decades, who come in and just hit other lifts and still hit just as big a lifts in competition. Okay. What did they both have in common with their maxes? They both did 1 rep max lifts. It doesn't seem to actually be better. Now, people would argue, well, what about the technique work and everything else? Well, do you really think technique practice for your classic lift carries over? In other words, if you're practicing your technique at 85%, of course it looks perfect. But is that the same technique you're going to be able to use when you get under a max? Probably not. When we do a 1 rep max, though, you get into your groove, right? It ends up being its own technique, its own lift, and you're not going to max out on the classic lift every single week. It's not going to happen. You're going to stagnate. You're going to have overuse issues. It's problematic. That's the other downside. When you look at the guys who do the high specificity, how many of them max frequently on the classic lift? They don't. They're like, oh, we can't do it very often. We peak up to a max. Why? Because they know that they get hurt. They know that they burn out. Coaches and lifters who do this conjugate style, to where we're rotating different lifts all the time, don't have that problem. You can max out year-round. You can max out every single week. Standard on conjugate is to hit 2 max lifts a week. That's pretty much the standard. That's the norm. You can do that year-round, and you're always ready to max. You're always technically peaked because you're used to maxing out. And the classic lift becomes just another one of the 57 exercises that you're maxing on. It becomes not a big deal. Because you learn your technique on the ramp up. In other words, if you've maxed on 7 different types of squats, you already know how to just ramp up to a max on a squat. So when you get to your classic lift, what do? You just start adding weight and you ramp up. You get into your groove as you go. Because that's the difference between maxing out. When I say that maxing out is a skill, what is it that we're saying? The number one, learning to strain and grind and push while staying tight against a really heavy weight. That's one of the skills. Well, that's not lift specific, is it? It's not lift specific, because you can be in a different groove that day. But that's just learning to grind and to strain, right? That's part of what we do with the max. That's a skill. That carries over across the board. Learning to grind and strain against a deadlift and a squat will carry over to each other. Any sort of press will carry over to any sort of press. Learning to grind and strain. It's just a skill. That's it. We could argue that the deadlift will even carry over to the bench on that. What's the other part? Learning to ramp up. Because when we hit a max lift, we come in and we add weight till we get to a max. You just keep hitting lift after lift. Like, for example, this cambered bar squats I'm doing here. I think the day I did that with the chains, with the 57 chains, I just kept ramping. I went to something like 445, 465, 485, 500, 515. I just kept adding weight till I'm like, yep, that's pretty much a max. It got heavy. You learn how to ramp up. Okay, that is a skill. So what do you mean? Learning to add weight to skill? No, learning to find your groove is a skill. As the weights start getting heavier, you start having to shift yourself into tighter and tighter positions and find the balance in the bar path. Okay. These are not technical movements, and that's something that people do not seem to grasp. Squat, bench, and deadlift are not technical exercises. Now, we could argue, well, noobs need to learn the technique. Yeah, noobs need to, but if you've been lifting several years and you know how to do 15 different exercises with good form, you already know how to move. You already know how to groove. The people who have issues with just digging in and learning the technique on these movements and need to practice them are novices who don't know how to move or do anything. All right, when you take a novice and they can't even perform a good morning correctly, well, obviously they need practice. But once you learn how to brace yourself and get tight and feel your body and move on any number of exercises, you're going to be able to pick up a new lift and do the same thing. Because you've now learned how to lift. You've learned how to brace. You've learned how to get tight. You've learned that, oh man, I've got to keep my knuckles pointed up on all presses. Right? You've learned that I have to brace my core. I have to set my hips a certain way with any sort of pull or squat or anything. Right? And a lot of our smaller exercises teach us how to get in these positions. Okay? Good morning will teach you a lot of the positions you need for the squat and the deadlift. But novices need to learn how to lift. That's their issue. So once you know how to lift and you are basically proficient at most of these big movements, practicing them more is not going to do a lot for you. You already know how to do them. And what good does practice do with 80% or 85%? You already know the technique. If you can do one rep at 85% with perfect form, you now have perfect form. That's it. Now you need to learn how to max, and you need to get bigger and stronger. It's the only way your lift's going up. These are not the Olympic lifts that require a large degree of skill and technical proficiency. I'm talking about squatting, pulling, and pressing, guys. This stuff is not exactly complicated. There's a very, very, very short and small learning curve. And a max is a max. It carries over. Even if you change the range of motion by 2, 3, 4 inches either direction, it carries over. You go to a box, not a box, chains, bands, different bars. Doesn't matter. It will still carry over because you're practicing hitting a max. And you're practicing doing it against different angles and strength curves, which would be great if anything goes wrong when you're hitting a max on something. You're used to just pulling yourself back into your groove. You're used to unusual grooves. You learn to just lock it out. It all carries over. Alright guys, well that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.